Some people who watched our previous videos asked us to do more videos on other popular presenters on philosophy on social media, and we're doing one more, probably just one more, which is on the School of Life, which was particularly mentioned by these viewers. And I didn't know that site before, but I watched that one video, their video on Eastern philosophy, in particular on Lao Tzu. I discovered again some problems that I think are worth addressing, and that's what I'm going to do now. The problems, I think, are not specifically related to social media presentation of Eastern philosophy or of Daoism, but they are more general problems. Problems related to the perception and representation of Eastern philosophy and of Daoism in not only the West, basically everywhere now in our times. So the video gives us a good opportunity to uncover certain issues. Kindly enough, a few other people asked about, just to quote them, how you read and interpret a Zhuangzhou. I'm not going to talk about this today, but I hope you can check out Philosophy in Motion, which is another channel we have, which is just animating stories from the Zhuangzi and showing different possibilities of reading these texts, which I think are really interesting and also have a lot to say to issues that are still very relevant today. So the video by the School of Life that I'm talking about today this is useful to know. Right now it has 1.8 million viewers. It's also a short video, just 5 minutes or something like this. When I then looked at this video, I found quite to my surprise that of the 6 quotes, supposed quotes from the text Lao Tzu that are introduced in the video, of these 6, only 2 are actual quotes. 2 are half fakes, that is, they somehow refer to materials in the Lao Tzu, but not really directly correspond to them. And 2 of the 6 quotes are actually full fakes. They do not translate something that is in the actual text. I was able to find the sources of these fake quotes through another website by Stefan Stennott, which is called Fake Lao Tzu Quotes. And he located the sources not only for these, but for many other fake quotes in other locations. The 2 ones in the School of Life video are the following. First fake quote is, "To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders." And as Stefan Stennott found out, this is actually the source for this quote, is an introduction to a translation of the Lao Tzu by the famous translator Arthur Waley in 1934. But it's not from the Lao Tzu, it's actually from the Zhuangzi. And the translation of the sentence is also problematic. Literally translated, the sentence means something like, the heart of the sage is still and is like a mirror of heaven and earth. So the translation is problematic, but even if it wasn't problematic, simply it's not from the Lao Tzu, period. The source of the second quote is also very peculiar. The second fake quote is the following: "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." And again, Stefan Stennott found out that this quote is from a book by John Haider, published in 1985, and the book is entitled The Tao of Leadership, Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, Adopted for a New Age. And in the preface of this book, John Haider declares very openly that his book is not a translation. He does not know Chinese. He read through various translations of the Tao Te Ching and then reflected on the chapters and then put his reflections into words. So this second quote is a quote not from Lao Tzu, but a quote from John Haider, where he adapts Daoism for, as he says himself, for a new age. So it's literally a new age representation of Daoist philosophy. What is further interesting is if you look at the context of how the quote is presented in the video, a blatant contradiction comes to light. So again, let's look at the quote. The quote from John Haider says, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." Just a few seconds earlier, the text of the School of Life video basically makes the complete opposite statement. It says, "We spend a great deal of time worrying about what we ought to become, but we should instead take time to be who we already are at heart." So that's a direct contradiction, because Haider says we shouldn't worry about what we are, but try to become something. And then the School of Life video says the exact opposite, that we shouldn't worry about what we become, but just be what we right now are. Next to the fake quotes, there is another problem, what we could call a fake attribution of the Lao Tzu text to the person Lao Tzu. And this is an interesting problem, because at the beginning of the video, it is actually stated correctly that, I quote, "In reality, the Tao Te Ching is likely to be a compilation of the works of many authors." So in the beginning, the video reflects on the present state of research, which basically generally assumes that the Lao Tzu, the text, or as it is otherwise also called the Tao Te Ching, was transmitted over a long period of time, orally and literally, and many people contributed to this process. And probably the person Lao Tzu is just a legendary author that was later assigned to the text. And in fact, all the early versions of the text do not come with an author. The notion of authorship in early China and also in other earlier cultures was just simply not as it is today. And the text was not generally assigned to an author. This is basically only a later product of the history of the text. So even though the video in the first part very clearly points out that the Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching should not really be attributed to the person Lao Tzu as its author, in the second half of the video, that's what the video does. It ascribes these quotes, two of them half fake, two of them fake, explicitly to Lao Tzu, and says this is what Lao Tzu wrote and this is what Lao Tzu said. The matter of the authorship of the Lao Tzu may seem just a minor matter, but it is not. It has a lot of implications. Just let's reflect on this. As scholarship now assumes, the text has been transmitted over a long time and a lot of people contributed to it. And then only later there was one author assigned to it. That sort of covers up the real history of the production of the text and many aspects that have to do with the actual production of the text. I'll just mention one to explain this problem. Actually, the Lao Tzu and the Daoist tradition in general contains a lot of proto-feminist elements. And if you want to read more about this, I recommend the works by Wang, and we'll put a link to some of her, or put information on some of her writings in the description of this video. Now, given this fact that there are quite a few proto-feminist elements in the Lao Tzu, it may make sense to assume that, for instance, also some women in one way or another contributed to the production of the text. But of course, by assigning the text to just one author, old man precisely, all the other potential contributors of the text get covered up. So we do not know. We do not know if any women or in fact anyone else who contributed to the text. But going back to the School of Life video. So actually the video consists of two parts. In the first part, as I said, they give a pretty accurate overview of what the Lao Tzu is as a text and of the legendary nature of its author. But then, interestingly enough, in the second half of the short video, they basically ignore everything they said in the first part and now say, Lao Tzu said this, Lao Tzu said that, Lao Tzu wrote this, Lao Tzu wrote that. So, in effect, what they do, they now regard the legend as real. So I think we can say they switched to some sort of traditional fairy tale mode in which they represent the text, where they have this fairy tale figure, Lao Tzu, being the actual old man who tells us all these, shares all these bits of wisdom with us. Now the question we can ask ourselves is, why do they do this? Why do they switch from the actual critical mode in the first part of the video to the kind of fairy tale mode in the second part of the video? And in addition to that, we can ask ourselves, why do they get away with that? The answer to both of these questions, I think, is quite straightforward. It's because it's Eastern stuff. With Eastern stuff, maybe you don't really have to be that serious, right? It's difficult to imagine that something like this would happen in a video on Kant, right? You wouldn't just randomly ascribe something that was actually said by Hegel, for instance, to Kant. So you at least have to somehow consult the original text or the scholarly sources. But with Eastern stuff, that's apparently not really necessary. Some sort of fairy tale mode seems to be perhaps not simply even accepted, but even expected to a certain extent. So when it gets to Eastern philosophy, this fairy tale mode seems to be something that appeals to people, and this may be also why the video is so popular. I think we can maybe distinguish between, there are many different modes of philosophizing, but we can distinguish between a more critical mode of philosophizing and another mode of philosophizing which we could maybe call some sort of feel-good mode of philosophizing. So critical philosophy, and Kant as a representative, critical philosophy makes you doubtful, maybe sometimes it's even slightly upsetting, it's intellectually challenging. And for us it's perfectly normal when we do Western philosophers that we read them, so to speak, in a critical key, that these are our expectations. But that's very different when it gets to Eastern philosophy. In Eastern philosophy, we are kind of expecting that some old wise man is going to tell us something that makes us feel good. Things like the video presents about, uniting with nature and other things that provide people with somehow warm, positive feelings. And this is also, if you look at the reactions of the video, how many viewers react to the video. When I saw this, it actually reminded me of what Marx famously said about the function of religion, that is some sort of opium for the people, right? And in a certain sense, it seems that Eastern philosophy, or the representation of Eastern philosophy, fulfills a similar function. That it also serves as somehow as an opium for a large part of the contemporary, and particularly Western, but increasingly global public. Now, some opium from time to time may not necessarily be the worst thing if you have a lot of stress and so forth. So I wouldn't say that in and of itself that is a problem, but the problem is if you only have opium. Really, if you look at the overwhelming, particular popular representation of Eastern philosophy in the West, it switches to this kind of feel-good fairy tale mode, which, as I just said, is maybe a little too much opium in connection with Eastern philosophy. If we look at this theoretically, I think the phenomenon has already been very well explained by a famous book by the Palestinian author Edward Said, which was published in the 1970s. And has the title Orientalism. He was talking about the so-called Near or Middle East, but I think that concept Orientalism can be easily extended also to the Far East, and this video is a good example for this. Now, what does Orientalism mean? Orientalism basically means that the image of the Orient, of the East, was produced by the Western colonizers of the East. And they constructed an image of this East, often a very exotic image, and that was then imposed on the East, and to a certain extent then also reproduced, internalized by the Easterners themselves, and then became something like a stereotypical representation that dominated the perception of whatever is Eastern. And again, like something very similar also happened with respect to China. And to give you two concrete examples for this kind of cultural mechanism. The first one with regard to China. The first one is one of the major export items from China to the West in the early times of imperialism, already in the 16th, 17th century, namely porcelain, which is precisely therefore also called China. And so China had a big porcelain industry, so they decided, oh, we can make a business by selling these to our people here in the West. But what they actually then did was to create a specific type of export porcelain, of export China, that looked very different from the porcelain that was actually produced for the Chinese market and used by Chinese people. So it was this Orientalist porcelain that was specifically produced for a Western elite consumer market. A similar example from today's culture is Asian restaurants, right? Where also Asian restaurants in the West produce a specific kind of Orientalist version of Chinese food that is specifically catered to the Western consumer. And again, according to Side at least, this all happens within some form of hierarchical imperialist framework, where this image is imposed on the Oriental other by the colonizer. And to a certain extent, something similar also happens not only with material things like porcelain or food, but also with immaterial things like ideas and philosophies. And so I think it makes sense to understand the representation, or at least a large part of the public representation of Asian philosophy to the West in the wider context of this notion of Orientalism. This switch to the fairy tale mode, to the feel-good mode in the video about Lao Tzu, I think also represents a switch from critical mode to Orientalist mode in the representation of Asian philosophy and Daoist philosophy. Now, to look a little further into this, in order to make the porcelain or to make the food attractive to the Western consumers, you have to mix the Oriental exotic appearance of the item with something that the Westerner is already familiar with. So you have to kind of blend the exotic with the familiar. And exactly the same mechanism also happens in the case of philosophy. And the School of Life video, again, is a very good example for this mechanism. So what is this specific philosophical spice that is mixed into Eastern philosophy so that it appeals to the Western consumer? We'll just have to look at the fake quote. And the fake quote in the video shows us exactly what this spice is. Let's look at the quote again. It says, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." And then actually what we are supposed to learn from this is also presented to us by the School of Life video. They say, and they also put it in writing, we need to be in touch with our real selves. So this is, in a nutshell, the rhetorics, the semantics, the vocabulary of what Charles Taylor has called the age of authenticity. It's this typical central modern quest of finding out who you are, discovering your true self. Right? The word originality is very central to this, and originality basically has a double meaning. Right? On the one hand, it means to go to find your origin, where you come from, discover your true selves, or it means to be original in the sense of being creative. In any ways, in this combines the central idea of authenticity, which is kind of this individualist self-expression idea. So the age of authenticity is also something that we can describe maybe as whatever, the focus on the individual. And this can be kind of philosophically here, but it can also be, for instance, economically. It can also be legally with individual rights and so forth. And it's no coincidence that the actual book where the fake quote comes from is a book basically written for managers, right? The Tao of leadership. So it's basically, you're supposed to learn from this how you can be a successful individual in a capitalist competition context. As an aside, I think the fact that this authenticity ideology is attached in this video to Daoism, and the way it is attached in this video to Daoism, shows a core paradox of authenticity, namely its inherent non-authenticity, right? They use a fake quote to show that Lao Tzu is, if not all about, then at least substantially about authenticity, and they use a fake quote to show this. But this is a general element of authenticity, that you learn authenticity by copying the authenticity of others, right? You have to, someone teaches you how to be authentic, which is an inherent contradiction. And this, of course, also leads to the fact that then everyone is authentic, and we develop this a stereotype authenticity. Authenticity itself breeds stereotypes. It becomes a stereotype. And in the same way, the fake focus on authenticity in the video creates a stereotypical perception of Daoist philosophy. So what is the problem with this kind of representation of a Daoist philosophy in the fairy tale mode? Well, it's not necessarily that it somehow misses what Daoism really is, because as a matter of fact, Daoism has always been different things to different people. And you could very well make the argument that today's Daoism for managers is also a legitimate form of Daoism. But the problem is precisely to basically cover up all these different dimensions of Daoism and to narrow it down to this one form, and then to put this very modern, very contemporary form in the fairy tale mode and present it as this is what the old man said, and this is kind of the original Daoism. So really what's wrong is not that they say something that is un-Daoist or non-Daoist, but that they create and fabricate a stereotype of Daoism which somehow dominates, totally dominates the perception of Daoism, and thereby eliminates a lot of what is interesting actually about Daoist philosophy. What is wrong is that it is the creation and perpetuation of a stereotype. It's a production of a stereotypical Orientalist image of Daoism that basically replaces a wide variety of different forms of Daoism that can be meaningful in different ways. In this way, I think the video, as an example of a widespread dominant representation of Eastern philosophy in contemporary society, does actually a disservice to Eastern philosophy in general and to Daoist philosophy in particular. As a matter of fact, Eastern philosophy and Daoist philosophy, again in particular, is just as critical, just as subversive, and just as diverse as many Western philosophies. It is not just fairy tale Daoism. There may well also always have been an element of fairy tale Daoism even within the Chinese tradition. But there are so many other things that are really interesting about Daoism. For instance, it had a strong influence on the formation of legalist philosophy, a socio-political philosophy at the time. It had a very strong influence on the formation of strategic thought with the Sun Tzu, the art of war. And most importantly, at least from my perspective, it developed as a critique of what I'd like to call the Confucian regime of sincerity, the dominating ethics of the time. And this is also, by the way, something that a Marxist approach to Daoist philosophy, which I myself learned when I was a student in China a long time ago, highlights, right? From this perspective, Daoism is seen as somehow the lower class philosophy that subverts the dominating higher class philosophy of the Confucians. So it's basically, there is also this subversive socio-political element to Daoism that is very interesting. And of course, all that gets eliminated when we switch to this fairy tale mode of Daoist philosophy. So the real problem, the biggest problem of the video is maybe not even the fake quotes, but is the title of the video, namely that it somehow pretends to represent what Eastern philosophy is all about. So really, the criticism I have is, don't reduce Daoism to an Orientalist age of authenticity fairy tale, which is told by one old wise guy.